Okay, so good afternoon, and we are so excited to be here on this panel on Pell and economic justice. We are going to be discussing the structural inequalities in education and employment and how Pell can really potentially redress these opportunity gaps. My name is Ivelisse Gilestra. I am the community organizer for CCF, which is an organization that provides direct services for justice impacted women in the area of higher education and advocacy, because we believe on the premise idea that successful reentry does not have to look like struggle or survival, but by thriving. And I want to introduce this video by Congressman Bobby Scott, representing the 3rd District of Virginia, chairman of the House Committee on Education and Labor, and also a champion and key ally in the fight to restore Pell Grant.
Good afternoon. I'm Congressman Bobby Scott from Virginia's 3rd District, and I chair the House Committee on Education and Labor. I want to thank Equity is Justice for hosting today's discussion, as well as the panelists for participating in this event. As the demand for workers to obtain a post-secondary education increases, so does our responsibility to eliminate barriers to higher education. Restoring Pell Grants for incarcerated individuals is a critical part of a broad strategy to expand opportunity for marginalized communities across the country. After decades of a criminal justice policy based on slogans and sound bites rather than research and evidence, we now incarcerate a higher portion of our citizens than any country on earth. That approach may be tough on crime, but it is certainly not smart on crime. Denying access to Pell Grants for incarcerated Americans is an unnecessarily punitive and actually counterproductive policy that actually costs taxpayers money by contributing to recidivism and making it harder for formerly incarcerated individuals to support themselves and their families. The evidence clearly shows that post-secondary education programs in prison can help incarcerated Americans become role models and build healthier prison environments. They can reduce the odds of recidivism by 43%, lower incarceration costs nationwide at $360 million a year, and secure good-paying, high-demand jobs for returning citizens. To address the current education gap, Congress must learn from the success of the Second Chance Pell pilot program, which President Obama launched in 2015, and restore Pell Grant eligibility for incarcerated Americans. The College Affordability Act, which was reported by the Committee on Education and Labor last year, repeals the ban on Pell Grants for incarcerated students and expands opportunities for justice-involved individuals to get an education and successfully re-enter their communities. The research makes clear that restoring Pell Grant eligibility for incarcerated Americans is a good investment. So I'm optimistic that this consensus can lead to bipartisan action. So I encourage all Equity is Justice participants today to continue making your voices heard, and I look forward to working with you to ensure that all incarcerated Americans and all Americans can access an education that empowers them to reach their full potential. Thank you.
And thank you, Chairman Bobby Scott, for that message. So Equity is Justice is a collaboration of people and organizations that share a mission to really center the voices of those directly impacted. And some of the organizations and individuals include College and Community Fellowship, the formerly incarcerated College Graduates Network, Drug Policy Alliance, the Vera Institute, Michelle Jones, Erin Corbett, and the Second Chance Educational Alliance, and many other formerly incarcerated folks that work within these organizations, and they seek to uplift those who have been touched by the criminal legal system. And before I let this wonderful panelists introduce themselves, I want to say that there will be a section of Q&A period at the end, so you can really drop your questions below, or use the Equity is Justice also tag for Twitter. We will pull the questions, and thank you. And let's start with Antoinette Burns. Let's start with you. Let's introduce ourselves now.
How are you?
Tell us who you are, Antoinette.
Okay, my name is Antoinette Burns, and I'm a public policy researcher for Indiana on the issues for the prison.
Let's continue with Allison.
Hi, I'm Allison Denbeck. I'm the Executive Director of Congressional and Public Affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I focus on the education, labor, and workforce development issues, and have recently taken on the role of being the person in charge of implementing our equity of opportunity agenda. Thanks for having me.
Let's continue with Tiffany Jones, and then Satra.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Tiffany Jones. I'm the Senior Director of Higher Education Policy at the Education Trust. We're a national policy and advocacy organization who fights for educational opportunities for students of color and students from low-income families, from early education all the way through higher ed. I look forward to the conversation today.
And now you, Satra Taylor from Education Trust.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Satra Taylor, and I'm a higher education policy analyst at the Education Trust. And I have the pleasure of leading our work at the intersections of higher education and criminal justice, as well as engaging student voice and activism. And I'm very excited to be here today.
Thank you all, and I am super excited to just share space and build with all you wonderful women. So this is a question that is going to be addressed all of you. So we know that for individuals, a college degree can change their earned income. So, but this isn't a course of a lifetime, but this is about the individual. So what about if we think beyond the individual and we really focus on the community? What would obtaining a college degree, how can it impact the community in which the college degree holder lives in? So should we start with Tony?
Okay. Well, I would say that having the degree, it makes a difference, because should you have a felony, it gives you an additional boost to get into a job, because you already have an issue. You know, when you have that felony, it makes it hard to do anything. So I really think that's really the basics of what I have right now with that.
Let's go to, thank you, Tony, for that. Let's go to Satra.
Thank you, Evilise. To answer this question, I also want to provide some context here. So we know that at least 95% of individuals who are incarcerated will eventually return to their communities. That also includes 600,000 individuals each year. These individuals are disproportionately coming from low-income backgrounds and communities of color. And we also know that we live in a society where an estimated 65% of jobs today require some form of post-secondary education. But according to a recent report by New America, just 7% of adults incarcerated complete a certificate, 2% complete an associate's degree, and fewer than 1% complete a bachelor's degree or beyond while incarcerated. I would like to quote also Chris Wilson, and when he says reinstating Pell grants for individuals who are incarcerated will offer them a chance to pursue higher education, preparing them for return to life outside of prison, and providing opportunities for higher paying positions and reducing the probability of recidivism, which echoes the sentiments of Chairman Bobby Scott, but as well as Tony. And research also makes clear that higher education in prison pays healthy dividends to students in prison, to the prison culture, and the broader public. However, I want to make clear that reinstating Pell is only the first step. States can also provide state-based financial aid to support higher education for currently and formerly incarcerated individuals. And in an upcoming brief I've co-authored, we found that about half of the 24 active statewide free college programs we analyzed were designed in a manner that was not inclusive of individuals who are directly impacted. Our findings echo those of the Vera Institute of Justice, as well as the Council of State Governments Justice Center, which observed over half of these states impose restrictions specifically on people who are incarcerated and accessing state financial aid. So in these conversations, I just hope we emphasize that anyone who is directly impacted, who has the desire to pursue higher ed, be provided that opportunity. And it should not be preserved for just a selected few.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Satra. With Tiffany, if you guys, Satra was very broad with her answer. So if you folks want to add, if not, I'm going to. Would you like to add something, Allison?
Yes. So I do have one thing, and I'm sorry, I clearly just got kicked off there for a moment. So sorry about that. Okay. But the one thing I want to say, just right, part of the education, coming from the business community's perspective in general, part of education is to help ensure that individuals have the skills and knowledge that employers are looking for. And so if you aren't able to, whether it's a certificate degree or an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, whatever it is, those are skills that employers are looking for. If you don't have access to that education, then you don't have access to gaining the knowledge that employers are looking for. If you don't have access to that, then you're going to have difficulty finding a job. I mean, there are other barriers, to the point that Satra was making, there are other barriers to employment, and we do have to remove those other barriers as well. But to have a limit to access to education, you're in training, you're automatically disadvantaging anybody who is incarcerated, and you're specifically disadvantaging communities of color because they are the ones who are going to be more disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system. And I say that not as I'm obviously a white woman, so it's a difficult thing to talk about. I put that out there freely, but we have to address the education access, because that's how we ensure that people who are returning are able to reintegrate into society, because then they're able to get jobs. And that's how you help the whole community by helping everybody economically.
Thank you. Exactly. And be equipped to navigate the different changes of the world and also disrupt the inequalities that we find systemically. And with this disruption of education serving as a disruption, how would education in prison will serve as a disruption in the dominant narrative? And Tony, this question is for you. We know that people are fighting for those formerly and currently incarcerated, but even sometimes with the best of intentions, we see that the language can be dehumanizing. Is there any language that you had found to be dehumanizing?
There has, when they speak about people who have been incarcerated, it's always, they still refer to people who are post-incarcerated as offenders or ex-offenders, or even while you're still incarcerated, you're offender 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, we're no longer offending, and one offense does not make you a habitual offender. So I think that's part of the language that is extremely offensive, because you can't get away from that. And to go back into the previous question, one thing with the education that you give, it has to be education that's current, because a lot of the skills that they offer in the prison are tailored specifically for women. You have sewing, you have housekeeping, you have all of these domestic things. But if you can't get something else. You know, there are other options aside from domestic work. So it's as if the prison is still stuck in
On
the
gender
1940s,
norms.
1950s.
Mm-hmm. And we spoke about this, how sometimes the prison is still practicing these gender norms that are collectively and collecting a harm that will transfer into the communities one as we have seen.
Yes.
So this question is for Tiffany, and the group can answer this as well. And it is still on the narrative, on the dominant narrative. So we hear a lot on individuals' personal redemptive arc, this whole narrative about redemption. So at what point is this harmful? And do we need to start tackling the issues at the intersection of criminal justice and the language society is using that is based on systemic roots of incarceration? So, for example, when are we going to start using this is a first chance and not a second chance?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think a lot of times in the advocacy work, trying to appeal to folks who might otherwise not be engaged in these issues, folks work really hard to demonstrate that folks who have been impacted by the criminal legal system are worthy, and deserving. But we have to tell the full truth about people's opportunities that they've been presented with since birth and how that impacts, in many cases, not having a choice in the first place. So it's not always about, again, people having made bad choices and need to be redeemed. It's also about the impact of systemic injustices that they face since early on. And I can give a few quick examples of what that looks like when it comes to education. So for example, EdTrust has done research that demonstrates that school districts that serve the largest populations of students of color, so Black and Latino students in particular, they receive $1,800 less per student than those that serve small populations of students of color. So that adds up, right? So for a district with 5,000 students, these numbers can accumulate to a $9 million gap in funding. And so, you might ask the question, what does that matter? What does that funding matter? Well, you underfund schools, you underfund the resources that students need, you deprive them of the necessary tools and supports to prepare students to be, strong leaders and learners. It comes into, when students do face challenges, being able to have access to guidance counselors and things like that. And in fact, today there's 1.7 million students who attend school that have a sworn law enforcement officer, but no guidance counselor. So again, the question is, what types of choices are being presented to? We're talking about children at this stage, right? And that has an impact to the statistics Satra shared earlier on about the low educational attainment of folks who are incarcerated. These decisions policymakers are making matters in terms of, again, the opportunities that are presented and how that translates when it comes to higher ed, for example. It means among especially the most selective colleges that people of color, students from low-income families are still incredibly underrepresented overall. And unfortunately, folks might believe that we're getting better, there's being improvements, maybe worse over time because of the types of barriers that exist. So for example, the Education Trust put out a report called Segregation Forever. It was an analysis of 101 of the most selective institutions, public colleges, mind you, in the country. And they found that they would have to add about 200,000 Black students and nearly 200,000 Latino students to reflect the racial makeup of their states. And again, among these really prestigious, really well-funded public colleges, most of them are enrolling a smaller percentage of Black students today than they did 20 years ago. And while oftentimes the enrollment of Latino students has slightly improved, most of the colleges are not keeping pace with Latino population growth. And again, that means that Black and Latino communities are not having the same access to public colleges that their tax dollars support. And so again, the question becomes from childhood all the way through adulthood, what types of options are being put on the table? And to just reinforce what Satra brought up around if jobs are expecting people to have college opportunity and degrees, what choices will folks have to support their families if they're not being provided these opportunities? So again, making policy changes like removing the ban on Pell Grants that could increase education opportunities for folks impacted by the criminal legal system is really, really important, because in many cases, they were never offered the proper access to high quality education that they deserve in the first place.
Thank you for that, Tiffany. And I want to remind folks that they can add their questions and their comments on the chat box. And Setram, still with the narrative and the disruption in this dominant narrative, you know, when advocating, we often have people that really refer to or believe that restoring Pell would really take away money from non-incarcerated students. And there's also a lot of emphasis on recidivism. So how do we shift, or how can we move from this narrative to something that is more people-centered?
Thank you for that question. It's something that I just want to throw out there that you'll see throughout all of my answers. I try to quote folks who are directly impacted, who have spoke on these issues, even though they can't be here today. I want to make sure their voices are amplified on this panel. And so I'd like to share a quote from a student at the Second Chance Educational Alliance in response to this in Connecticut, who said in an op-ed, "The dominating rhetoric of higher education programs in prison has focused primarily on recidivism. What the rhetoric ignores, however, is what is essentially the ideological foundation undergirding our nation's belief about the transformative power of knowledge. As a society, we must rid ourselves of the notion that incarcerated people are less human. The longer the sentence, the more work that needs to be done to illuminate a new path for our misguided friend. The mindset of us all must be geared toward the betterment of the whole." I wanted to amplify his voice because he succinctly answers this question, but it also brings me to my next point of how we change this narrative. And that is a quote by Glenn Martin, which advocates like yourself, Evilise, in the criminal justice space honed into me when I first began this work. And that is, "Those closest to the problem are closest to the solution, but furthest away from the resources and power to help move and push us forward into the right direction." It's something that we at Trust try and make sure that we do in this space is ensure that we're centering the voices and expertise of those directly impacted to address these perpetuating issues, such as the narrative of recidivism is the goal and the way, and this is the reason why Pell should be restored. So that means we're consulting you all's expertise in developing policy recommendations. That means we're co-authoring on publications with you all to amplify your voices. We're presenting with you all on these issues because they directly impact you. We're joining coalitions to support the work and make sure our work align. And we're compensating you all for your expertise, as we would do for any other consultant in this field. This is just to provide you all with a few examples because it should and can go beyond that, including hiring, including creating leadership opportunities. And to close, I just want to emphasize something that Tony was saying about using humanizing language, a people first language. And that is one of the first things that we must do if we shift this narrative, is how do we refer to individuals who are incarcerated? The late Eddie Ellis said in his open letter on the question of language, and I quote, "One of our first initiatives is to respond to the negative public perception about our population as expressed in the language and concepts used to describe us. All terms devoid of humanness, which identifies us as things rather than as people. These terms are accepted as the official language of the media, law enforcement, prison industrial complex, and public policy agencies. However, they are no longer acceptable for us, and we're asking people to stop using them." So even to your question, the first thing to do is we need to figure out how do we refer to individuals who are incarcerated as people first, as human. And so thank you, Tony, for raising that as well.
And thank you all. And this also moves us from that way that we have been socialized to pathologize, everybody that goes into prison like it is not a pathway from social maladies or from marginalized communities that take into that path of incarceration. So thank you for this, for your answers. And talking about the barriers to educational access, Tony, once you embarked on your educational journey and experience, how many classes? We were talking about this, and I was taken aback because I have heard this story so many times. And how many classes did you take ultimately to finish your degree? How hard was it? Tell us about those.
It was extremely hard because I had over 200 credits. That would be one, but it started out with one school, then it switched to another school. So the new school, when you go to a new school at any college, on even outside, they want you to have at least half of your credits from there if that's where you're getting your degree from. So then you have to start all over. Some of your credits don't count. Take their credits, and then we had another school come in. So that it just, it was a lot. It was a whole process on trying to get a degree. But not only that, after I finished the degree and completed everything that they asked me to, they did not want to honor they didn't want to honor and give me the degree. They said that I just needed to wait until I got out and contact the school that way.
Wow.
Well, I am not. I did not. I've had to fight for about a year for them to give me,
the degree that you earned.
Yes, give me the degree that I earned. But not only that, I had to fight with the prison because the prison said, well, we have 2014, they had a new law passed. And so you could only get 1 year for a bachelor's degree or for any education. You get 1 year for education and 1 year for vocation. So I didn't apply. I didn't qualify for any vocation. So you're going to have to give me that. And they said, well, no, because we switched to the new law. Well, I had to fight with them because I was sentenced under the old law.
Right.
And I don't understand, I had no understanding as to why this was such a clear-cut case. I was sentenced on this date. The law took effect on this date. So what is the problem? But, finally, I had, administrators of the prison telling me that if I did not stop having my family call, if I didn't stop writing, that they were going to write me up on a Class B because I was bothering the staff. Okay, I'm going to keep writing you. And if you want to, if you feel that you need to throw me in lock for doing what is right for me and what is fair, then by all means, go ahead and do that. But you want me to, as the prison, you want me to do what you asked me to do because these are your rules. But now I'm going by your rules, and now you want to tell me no, that's unacceptable to me. So I ended up getting the cut, and it made a difference in my out date, So, these are the things that when people don't have their own voices and accept exactly what the prison says, that's when it becomes a problem because they want to just say just enough to pacify people or tell them what they need to hear to have them back off because they already know that you're not going to question and you probably don't know what your true rights are.
And on the penalty of probably going a lot, you said that yourself, which to me is atrocious when we're talking about receiving an education. Mm-hmm. So let me ask you, Tony, so during the reentry process that begins, it's supposed to begin while we are inside, do you think the process of reentry reflects low expectation of what you, your peers, your sister, us are expected to accomplish after incarceration?
Absolutely. It's very low. So they give you 2 weeks of reentry. It's, let me see, it was 2 weeks of reentry, but the law states it has to be at least 20 hours. So that is the minimum. So when you go, they had these classes. They gave me more sex ed classes than classes on where I can get a job. You know, you have internet access. You will not get on the internet to help me look for a job so I can start putting in applications prior to me leaving. But you will give me condoms, you will give me the health department, you will give me all of this information, but you won't help me with that. And that's a true disadvantage, because people need to at least see that there's something that they can go to. Because you have some people, I was there for 11 and a half years. So I saw people that came in and they had nothing. They were used to someone else taking care of them, so they didn't know what it meant to be independent. And if you don't know what it means to be independent, you go back to your old ways, and you can't stop if you don't stop people from going back to their old ways. And that's where the problem is with reentry. There's nothing. And the list that they give you for jobs, a lot of those jobs are, the list is outdated. Some of the places don't even exist anymore.
And it continuously perpetuates the same inequities that we find that are basically a reflection of what is going on in these marginalized communities within the prison. It's a reflection one of another. So talking about these disadvantages, let's talk about student debt and the obstacles in employment. Tiffany, restoration of Pell is not limited to prisons. It really encompasses, it involves an entire ecosystem of educational opportunity that currently will place or put Black, Brown, and Indigenous people at a major disadvantage. So can you speak to other issues like disproportionate student debt? And I know Educational Trust, you guys do phenomenal work with this, and how that hurt and how does it hurt communities that are at higher rates of incarceration when we find these disadvantages?
Sure. So, student debt's being talked about all over the place because it affects so many students, but it affects different communities in special ways. And one way to show that is to talk about a particular crisis that's happening among Black borrowers in particular. So Black students are more likely to borrow more, and have a harder time with repaying their debt than their peers. And this is true across income groups. We often try to make the point, this is not just because people are low income. It's also, again, this is about race. This is about the fact that Black people in particular have less wealth. So do Latino communities, because they've been locked out of opportunities in the past to build and gain wealth in their families. And that has an impact, so that when you do have debt, you, again, are often on your own to try to figure out how to pay it back, often getting underpaid, having a harder time in employment. And the issues related to the criminal legal system just make this harder for these communities. And so, again, just as a really startling example, when thinking about the most privileged Black people in particular, those coming from the highest income families, those who get to go to a 4-year college right after high school, really privileged, still 1 in 3 of those Black students default on their student loans, compared to about 5% of white students from that same income group. And again, default means that they weren't able to make that payment for about 270 days, and then it goes into default, and it has a terrible impact on your credit, your ability to buy a house or a car, or in some cases get a job. And because, again, they take that as reflecting your character. And so student debt already has this disproportionate impact on the communities already most harmed by the criminal legal system. And again, those particular individuals will face more challenges. And I just want to hit on, these communities are also unfortunately going to be disproportionately impacted by all the other crises that are happening in education and beyond. So that's true of the pandemic, of course. Black and Latino people are 3 times as likely to be infected and nearly twice as likely to die. And so that of course, is the worst case scenario, but also just keeping in mind that that means there's a collective grief happening in these communities. I have family members, others have family members who passed away, are more likely to have family members that have passed away from the virus. And how does that impact them and their well-being? Not to mention the conditions around safety for those who are incarcerated, and thinking about, again, how their programs have been impacted in terms of their access to be convened or have visitors come as instructors, but also just their health and well-being and safety. Are they being allowed to socially distance? Do they have access to the right health care? And again, being disproportionately impacted by all the other things that we discussed. And one thing I just want to mention, and then of course, so we can hear from other folks, is assuming folks beat all the odds, they're able, upon release, to enter a higher ed institution, their credits transfer, and they're ready to go, remembering that these communities also still face hardship because access is not inclusion. And so colleges across the country have a lot of work to do in terms of how they treat students from low-income families, how they address issues of racism. So they still have a hard time accessing faculty that look like them. They still are dealing with racist curricula. And so it's important, again, to remember that these things have a disproportionate impact on these communities, because dealing with racism on campus impacts student success and their well-being. And again, so there's a responsibility not to just, like Satra said earlier, removing the ban on Pell is the first step, but it's also about higher ed doing their part to alleviate some of these disproportionate burdens on the communities they claim to care about.
Thank you for that. And just bringing the visibility of systemic and just structural racism within all institutions, per se. Thank you. Allison, can you please tell us about the great work that the Chamber of Commerce is doing with the Equality of Opportunity Initiative, and how did this precipitated its creation? Who were the partners, goals, effectiveness? Tell us everything about the initiative.
Thank you for that question. I get very excited when I have the opportunity to talk about the Equality of Opportunity Initiative. So, the Chamber has actually been very involved in equity issues, particularly in education. We've partnered with education trusts for a very long time on equity issues in education. We had a business civil rights coalition during the last K through 12 reauthorization, for example. So the issues individually are not all new to us, but during the pandemic and then after the killing of Mr. Floyd, we really came together and said that this is the time for the business community to step up. And so we had an Equality of Opportunity summit on I think it was June 25th. And we had 10 different chamber CEOs, state chamber CEOs, who served on the executive committee on that. And it was a day-long summit, and it was very intense. But it was really focused on having discussions that then led us to developing this initiative. And the idea behind it is really that we're trying to find sustainable solutions to close race-based opportunity gaps, particularly in 4 areas. And they're all areas that we're talking about, right? Education, employment, entrepreneurship, because entrepreneurship rates are very low within communities of color. So we really want to focus on that. And then the criminal justice system. And obviously these 4 things are all interconnected. But having systemic inequalities in these areas then perpetuates broader inequalities in our society as a whole. It holds back individuals, it holds back businesses, and it hinders economic growth. So kind of what we've been talking about this whole time. So we really tried to have conversations with our business leaders, with governments, with on the state and local level, with academics and people who have been researching in this. And that's really how we developed our agenda. And the idea is that we're looking at what can the business community do on its own, right? Because not everything has to have a legislative solution. So we're already starting to tackle some of those things in those 4 key areas. But then also what has to happen on a state legislative level, on a local legislative level, and on a federal level. And in particularly in terms of the federal level, we've change the way we do. The chamber issues a annual legislative scorecard where we basically we rank members of Congress on how they vote. Up until last year, the rankings were based solely on votes, on floor votes. But everybody knows the way politics works around DC. That's not necessarily indicative of larger policy issues. So in 2019, we changed our scorecard to also have a bipartisanship score, which is 10%, and a what we call a leadership score. So basically, we identify bills in particular that we think are very important to either co-sponsor or to not co-sponsor, and you get a leadership score for that. And then the 80% is based on floor votes. Well, so in 2020, we're now changing that again to say, look, we've got this equality of opportunity agenda. We are going to tell you that we think these bills are so important that you need to co-sponsor them because they are going to address what we see as being opportunity gaps. And so we released we've got about a dozen bills that Congress has already introduced. Only one has passed the House, but there's a dozen bills that have been introduced and none of them have moved. And that's just unacceptable. And so the REAL Act, for example, which is the Pell restoration, a clean Pell restoration, that's one of those 12 bills. And the fact that that bill hasn't moved is just unacceptable.
It is. Thank you for that, Allison. And talking about the systemic inequalities and gaps, unemployment after release is a major concern for those who are formerly incarcerated. Research has shown that Black women are particularly vulnerable to returning home and finding so many obstacles in their search for a job. So what are the steps that institutions like prisons and community-based organizations can take prior their release to help mitigate this reality of just this difficulty with finding employment once out? Well,
I mean, to your point, right? When you're talking about unemployment rates for Black males who have been incarcerated are 28 percentage points higher than for Black males overall. Unemployment rates for women, Black women who have been incarcerated, are 37 percentage points higher than for Black women overall, and that's a concern. And having a prior conviction, I mean, they're talking about inequalities. Having a prior conviction definitely impacts whether or not employers, callback rates. And so some of those are things that need to be addressed in the employer community, and we're working on those. But I think to Tony's point, I think Tony made the point earlier about making sure that we are addressing that the training opportunities are actually meeting licensing requirements so that people can then leave and re-enter the community and have actual jobs. Some of that requires some occupational licensing reform on the state level because there are requirements that are ridiculous and have no real bearing on somebody's ability to fill those roles. But some of that is about making sure that the business community, that the chambers of commerce and that they're creating relationships with the prisons to help have some of those relationships. So as people are leaving and re-entering, that there are opportunities. Some of it is about creating better guidance and counselors to help through that. One of the things in Indiana specifically, the Chamber of Commerce there actually has an entrepreneurship program, for example, where they come in and they teach classes specifically on how to be an entrepreneur, and it's the finances of what it's like to run your own business. It's the questions of how to set up, like what paperwork has to be filed, like walking through, and then
right.
and then setting up with some micro grants to help as people are leaving, so that it's not just saying, oh, here, go do it, but we're not going to help you figure out how to have money, because having access to the money to set up the business is sometimes difficult. And so some of it is stuff that has to happen on a legislative level, but some of it is about having us all kind of go back to those communities. I mean, it's one of those things that the chamber is trying to do on a national level. Talk to our state and local chambers to really encourage and really work with them to get involved in the prisons, to get involved with their communities, so that they can help ensure that that transition is easier, and that you know, the knowledge is there, because it's not something you know instinctively.
You want to add something, Tony? Can we unmute her?
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. Okay. Yes,
you hear me
Tony,
now?
you're good.
So the program that you're talking about is the Ready program, and it is a very good program where they come in there and tell you, you know, give you all the information that you were talking about. The problem is there needs to be a bridge, because you can give someone the information, but when they are released, that's not the most important thing on their agenda. Getting a place to stay, finding a job so you can support the, you know, the entrepreneurial part of your life, you know, your dream is the second part, you know. And if you have, as a woman, you have kids, you're trying to get your kids back, you're trying to, there are a lot of other steps that come way before that. And that is the bridge, you know, that's the part that is not bridged. And I don't know if that's the part, maybe that's just something that's not thought about. You know, there's the resources are there, but you can't, those are not the important things right now, because you need money to get your kids or to pay fees. You know, you have to, probation. These are things, and a lot of things for prison they don't tell you about until you get ready to leave. 2 weeks before I left, they told me that I had to sign up on a registry. In my particular case, there was no violence committed. It was a conspiracy. However, they said that conspiracy is considered a violent crime, so I have to register as a violent offender. So these are things that people, you know, you find this out at the last minute. And if you really had thoughts of, yes, I'm going to start my own business, I can do this, I can do that, it's out the door. It's out the door, because you have to pay these people and you have to do all these other things that are mandatory, because that will send you back to prison if you don't.
I think to that point, and that's very helpful feedback for me to hear, so that I can make sure that that feedback continues to be shared with, you know, as we continue to work with our state and local chambers to set up programs like that. That's very helpful feedback for me to hear. So thank you for that. I think that that's part of why it has to be a whole community thing, because some of that I don't know that the chambers themselves would be able to help with, but partnering with, for example, some religious organizations or some of the other nonprofits who are helping with reentry, and making it more of a process, not for the person who is reentering, because to your point, they're obviously going to be preoccupied with other things, but making sure that they have one place to go who has already coordinated all of those support systems. And some of that can happen without having to have policy. This is, you know, policy changes. Some of that can happen on our own. And I think we need to, as communities that are interested in this, that, you know, think about how we make that happen.
Well, can I add one more thing to that?
Sure, of course.
With the churches and whatnot, while I was incarcerated, I was in the Plus program. I did every program that I could possibly do. But when I got out, I was no longer able to contact any of those people, because they were still volunteers in the prison. So any resources that I may need or may need to contact anyone, I had to sneak and do it to get information. And it could never be said that the information came from them, and they couldn't outright help me with anything and say, yes, I helped Antoinette Burns. It could not be done, because the prison policy, and the volunteer would be put out of the prison and no longer be able to come back as a volunteer.
Thank you all. And this basically demonstrates the impact that the carceral state and space has on Black women and on girls. Satra, can you briefly, for the sake of time, can you talk about the current initiative with a focus on the impact that this has on Black women and girls?
Yeah, so I'll try to be very quick. There are two current initiatives I'm aware of that I like to share. First is an edited volume that should be coming out in 2021, 2022. It's tentatively titled Black Women in the Carceral State, Tell Them We Are Not Monsters, edited by Doctors Ann Corbett and Catherine Weedle. And this volume is intended to offer critical insight into the current landscape of history, gender, educational access, and criminal justice, and does so through the elevation and amplification of the voices that are rarely heard, Black women. It's a beautiful thing. I had the opportunity to write a chapter for this edited volume with 4 phenomenal Black women, Dr. Jones included, discussing the intersection of education and the criminal legal system for Black girls and women. So as soon as that out, I encourage folks to purchase it and learn more about the landscape of higher ed, just education in general for Black women and girls. The second initiative I would like to highlight is a guide by my colleagues at Ed Trust in partnership with the National Women's Law Center. And it's a guide titled And They Cared, How to Create Better, Safer Learning Environments for Girls of Color. The guide offers steps for policymakers, advocates, and school leaders to address the racial disparities in school discipline, and offers guidance for how to reimagine school safety in ways that dismantle exclusionary discipline policies and practices, which we all alluded to in this conversation today, but especially for Black girls who face some of the greatest barriers to educational opportunities because of racial and gender biases embedded within school discipline policies, dress codes, and codes of conduct that target their cultural identity. And for anybody that's interested in learning more, I'll drop a link to that guide in the chat.
And this is our last question to all panelists. So we have heard about the obstacles, the barriers, how it will impact not only the individual, but the communities. So why is reinstating Pell so crucial in the present climate? And we could start with Tiffany.
Well, I'll be brief so we can hear from everyone and just say this matters because this is a time where higher education in particular has been very public and vocal about their commitment to justice and equity in light of the national reckoning around issues around race and policing and criminal justice. And it's important that they follow up those statements with real action. And one of the most important action steps they can take is to try to remove barriers that exist for the communities they're espousing to care so much about. And again, it's important that higher ed leaders and institutions have a strong and loud voice as they communicate to policymakers that this is the change that they would like to see. So it's about removing the ban on Pell, but it's also following it up with practices to make sure that these programs are high quality, that they're using all the resources they can to make sure students don't leave those programs with any debt, and to just make sure that the faculty teaching in those programs have all the resources and support they need to support the success of their students. And so I think it's important in this moment because it is an opportunity for higher education leaders in particular to try to get policymakers to do more than provide symbols and statements, but to take real action.
Thank you. And Tony, okay. So I know that Antoinette Burns has another event. So would you mind answering why do we need Pell before you leave?
Yes, here I am. I feel that we need Pell because we need to give people a hand up to better themselves. It's so hard, you know, upon being released, it took me 6 months to find a job. And I work in a restaurant. So 6 months is a long time and I have to pay, you know, fees and, you know, fines and whatnot. So this is something that is so necessary, because with this, I was able to move up and, work my way up, become a manager, become an assistant GM. And, I feel that having the degree helped me out a great deal. So, it may take a minute, it may take a little longer, but at the end result, it will pay off.
Thank you. And thank you, Tony, for being us. I know you're a busy woman, and she left, so I wanted. So what about in closing, Sasha and Allison, if you would like to add?
I'll just say really quickly, right? Speaking specifically about why now, we're facing an economic downturn right now, right? And how long that will be, and what those opportunities, but we don't know, right? But we do know that historically, just in general, people go back to school when there's an economic downturn. That the idea being is that you're gaining, kind of to the point I made at the beginning, so you can gain the skills and knowledge to have your own economic security. That is even more important and even more true now for people who are incarcerated, to make sure that they have the skills and the knowledge, so they're not re-entering the community at a time when it's already an economic downturn and there's already struggles. There are enough barriers right now as there are, and we should be addressing those barriers too, but we shouldn't be making it worse, and making sure that there's access to education to help overcome that, I think is really important.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly add that in this present climate, the country is dealing with what folks have called two pandemics, COVID-19 and racism. And what we're seeing, as stated by the folks at Movement for Black Lives, folks are mobilizing and rising up against all the ways that the criminal legal system has harmed and failed to protect Black communities. And this moment is going to require real solutions to address the races and the segregated and the violence against the Black community. And to be clear, reinstating Pell is one of those solutions, especially for a community that has continually been oppressed and exploited by all systems: healthcare, education, the legal system, and more. And I'll end there.
Thank you. And we have our first question in the chat. And it is from Jeremy Travis and Jonathan Feinstein. Why do we insist on measuring the effectiveness of college courses in prison by whether they reduce recidivism? And we tackle a little bit on that. And what are the other measures that matter? Living wage, employment upon reentry. How do we measure the impact of any college education? And why would we not use the same measures for college education for this subgroup of students? Anyone wants to answer that? And
I'll sort of answer it, because I know my panelists are going to have a different, potentially have a different answer than I do. One of the other, big bill that we supported in our equity of opportunity agenda when we released it was the College Transparency Act, because we think that it's very important for having accurate information so that as students are attending schools, all students, as they are attending schools and making decisions about their economic future, that they have accurate information about wage, about completion, about transfer credits, about all of it. And so not so much as an accountability measure, but as a knowing what is out there as you're making the decisions on what to pursue. And I think that it's important that individuals who are incarcerated have those opportunities to make the decisions that are going to best meet their skills, their desires, their American dreams. We want to make sure that they have that opportunity and have that knowledge.
Okay, the next question, because we're moving now with the questions, is from Terrell Blunt. Hi, Terrell. On the topic of economic justice, we need to discuss how HAP programs may be shepherding students in reentry from one form of slavery, physical, to another, financial, thank you, via student loan debt, while nearly all low-income students graduate with student loan debt. It is just not the same for those with a record who will face challenges securing employment? And maybe Tiffany, since you at Trust works a lot with student loan debt, maybe you want to answer that.
I'll just add, all of the challenges related to student debt I mentioned around default. Again, to Terrell's comment, will have even a bigger impact on this particular community because they're going to face more challenges and be discriminated against in the job market, as we talked about, by employers before they even have a chance to interview or be heard. And then not to mention issues around salary and promotion, all the things that are necessary to be able to pay back those large bills. And so, again, part of this conversation is about, removing the ban on Pell Grants, but it's a bigger conversation around making college affordable, period. And being affordable means that you take into account what resources communities have in the first place. So especially for the communities that are impacted by the criminal legal system, it's more important. That's why I said higher ed, it's not enough to just tell Congress to remove the ban on Pell. It's up to them to check themselves related to what are they charging students? What are their expectations for whether that's a grant or a loan or not? What are they paying faculty to teach in these programs? Are these adjunct faculty with no benefits that have to teach at 5 different institutions and make ends meet? How are they structuring and prioritizing their own resources to make sure that that financial burden doesn't fall onto the students, communities that are working in the prison education space? And this matters, and I think it's going to matter more in the future because of the economic downturn Allison mentioned. Higher ed, especially public institutions, are unfortunately probably going to be facing big cuts from the state. And so the last thing we want is them to view students who are incarcerated as some sort of cash cow, some opportunity for some additional students and revenue as enrollments are down right now in the middle of the pandemic. But instead to, again, view these students as whole students who are entitled to a affordable college education just like anyone else. But all that to say, I don't think removing the ban on Pell Grants alone can fix these problems. It's going to take, it's the first step, but it's going to take some partnership, some buy-in and commitment from higher education to not saddle students with debt. And that'll also require alignment from state and federal policymakers to make the necessary investments in higher ed institutions so that that can be a reality.
Thank you. Thank you, Tiffany. Let's see the next question. And thank you everyone that has joined us virtually. So this question is from Jeremy Travis. Question for Education Trust panelists. What is the role of the higher education sector, universities and colleges, in arguing for Pell restoration, and what changes are required in higher education to be open and welcoming to individuals with criminal records?
So I can start. Let me read the question one more time. I think one of the roles is just for higher ed leaders to amplify this issue, reach out to their representatives and make sure that they know that they have the opportunity to restore the Pell Grant for individuals who are incarcerated. Something that Tiffany also I want to bring back when she said access is not inclusion. They need to make sure that also if they are in these prisons, that when individuals are released, that there are articulation agreements in place so that those students can enroll on campus, that there are no barriers in terms of that. And something that students, when we visited in Connecticut, pushed us back on, because we were saying, these institutions need to make sure that when they go into these prisons, that they're bringing in, they have the same curriculum, they're bringing in the same philosophies and the same missions. And students pushed back on us and said, no, some of their missions and philosophies are entrenched with racist pedagogy, and they're founded on anti-Blackness. And so they also need to reassess their curriculum. And is it culture responsive? And is it fitting for the prison culture? But institutions definitely have a role in amplifying this issue and working with their Congress members and representatives, as well as the Department of Corrections, to make sure that the Pell ban is lifted. And I don't know if Tiffany has more that she'd like to add.
Thank you. The next question is from Noah Gillen. I hope that I'm saying your name correctly. And they would love to know, would love to hear from panelists about how parole requirements impact education upon reentry and what can be done. I can say myself as a person that was on parole only 3 months ago, that I've seen that it varies from parole agency to agency. Within one agency, you can find parole officers that will work with you, or that are more lenient in knowing that you are usually a full-time student, you're employed, while others just reinforce all those obstacles and barriers and try to really emphasize people to get employment as opposed to entering higher ed and you choosing that path. I'm gonna go to the next questions. It's from Vivian Denise. Oh, it's from Vivian Nixon. What can we say? Hi, Vivian. What can we say to colleagues and advocates working toward prison abolition goals? Say that providing education upholds and a just prison system. Does it have to be one or the other? And can we work on both?
I'm happy to just jump in there with the idea around framing. The idea is that Black people, Latino people, folks from low-income families have not been provided with the same educational opportunities as their peers. And so regardless of where they are, and whether they are incarcerated, whether they are released and maybe on parole or not had any interaction with the legal system, they should have an opportunity to have access to higher education. So to the question, I think it's absolutely both. We can reconsider the role of policing, incarceration as a whole, how to deal with, thinking about, safety and communities in a reimagined way that may or may not even involve prisons at all. At the same time, making sure that every single person that desires an education has access to one, regardless of where they are. And I definitely don't think that they're competing priorities. In fact, that they're very complementary, especially for the issue we talked about earlier related to this idea that many folks have been criminalized for simply trying to earn a living because they've been deprived of job opportunities that are more and more tied to whether or not they had access to education in the first place. So absolutely think that these are issues that can reinforce one another and work together quite well.
Thank you. And the last question is the role of community college in helping incarcerated people access good jobs. So what is the role of community colleges?
I mean, I think that the role of community colleges is similar to the roles of other institutions. I mean, community colleges are the backbone for, at least from the employer community perspective, are the backbone for providing skills and knowledge that we're looking for. Whether it's a certificate program or a career pathway program that helps build to an associate's degree, to a bachelor's degree. I mean, the community colleges are the foundation of it all, and so having them involved in this is crucial I think from at the very least from where I sit, but I suspect my co-panelists would feel similarly.
The only thing I would add quickly is that community colleges often are at the forefront of wanting to be the ones providing these access and opportunities, educational opportunities of folks incarcerated. But in higher ed, they are the underfunded institutions. And so that's why I said policymakers have to rethink. They can't say that they care about these communities and then continue to have gaps in some cases, they're funding students at selective colleges that have no prison ed programs. They'll fund them at 3 times as much per student than they do their community colleges, even though community colleges are serving these roles. And that has an impact on what supports they're able to offer to students and their success. So I think just to reinforce, they are playing this important role, but it's important for policymakers to adequately invest in community colleges so they can do this good work well.
And can I add one point to that is I think it's also important that those courses and all that they are actually credit bearing. That if the community colleges are offering courses that are not credit bearing, just because they're providing the skills and the background doesn't help along that career pathway in the long term. So it might help lead to an immediate certification, but it won't necessarily help as people want to continue along their education and their career path. And we would want to be very careful to make sure that we're not further disadvantaging individuals who have been incarcerated.
And before we leave, do you folks have any final thoughts? Well, I want to thank you personally. You have been phenomenal. I want to thank everyone that has tuned in virtually. And we want to make sure that you stay tuned. Equity is Justice will be hosting another panel on September 30th. It will be a panel on racial equity. And on October 14th on universal eligibility of Pell. So you can follow us at the CCF Twitter account and stay posted. Thank you so much, folks.